I have trained a lot of young medics in the years since, and there is one story I tell all of them before they are done with me. I tell it slow, because it took me a long time to earn the right to tell it, and longer to understand what it cost me to be the man in it. I was not the hero of it. I want that clear at the start. I was the one who stood in the aid tent and watched and did nothing while they made a joke of her, and I have carried that a long time. So when I tell you this, I am not telling you about a woman who was underestimated. Every one of you already knows a woman was underestimated. That is why you are leaning in. I am telling you about the men who did the underestimating, because I was one of them, and because you are going to be tempted to be one of them, and I would like to spend you that lesson cheap instead of the way I bought it. Her name is not the point. On the manifest that came up to Outpost Kettle that spring she was listed as a medic, a fill, a body sent to plus up the aid station while our senior corpsman rotated home. That is all any of us knew. A medic. A quiet one, mid-30s maybe, though it was hard to say. She had the kind of weathered stillness that could have been 30 or 50, the kind you get from a lot of sun and a lot of waiting. She came off the resupply bird with one duffel and a rifle case she carried herself, and would not let the loadmaster stack. And I remember thinking, before I thought anything else, that a medic who bobbied a rifle case like that was going to be a problem. Because medics who thought they were shooters got people killed trying to be something they weren't. That was the first wrong thing I thought about her. I want you to notice how easy it was. I had not heard her speak. I did not know her name past the manifest, and I had already decided what she was and what her limits were from the way she carried a box. That is how it starts. It never starts with hatred. It starts with a small, confident guess that costs you nothing to make, and then you spend the rest of the day defending it because it is yours. Outpost Kettle was not much. A walled combat outpost stuck at the mouth of a bad valley, a cluster of B-huts and HESCO and a mortar pit, and an aid tent that was really just a GP medium with a plywood floor and my cots in it. We sat there to watch a road. The road ran up through a canyon the Terps called the Throat, because it narrowed to almost nothing between two rock walls and then opened again, and everything that moved between the district center and the outposts north of us had to swallow itself through that gap. Convoys hated it. I hated it. You could feel the ground get wrong as you came into it, the way an animal knows a thing is watching it. We had lost a truck in there the winter before. We did not talk about that truck much. Let me give you the place properly, because the place is part of why we were the way we were. Kettle sat at altitude, and altitude does things to men. The air was thin and the nights were cold even in the warm months, and the mail came when it came, and the resupply bird came when it came, and sometimes neither came for a long time, and a platoon left too long on a wall at the mouth of a bad valley starts to turn inward on itself, starts to run on its own private jokes and its own private hierarchy. The way a family isolated too long gets strange. We had been on that wall a while. We were low on the things that keep men decent: sleep, news, the sense that anyone above us remembered we existed, and we were high on the things that make men cruel in small ways, boredom chief among them. I say this not to excuse us. There is no excuse, and I am not reaching for one. I say it because cruelty rarely comes from monsters. It comes from tired, proud, bored people who have stopped being watched. And if you understand the soil, you will recognize it when it starts to grow in your own outpost, wherever your outpost turns out to be. The days had a shape. Stand to before light, when the whole outpost went to the wall in the cold and watched the valley resolve out of the dark and waited to see if this was the morning something came. Then the long grind of the day, the burn detail, the fuel, the endless small maintenance of a place that is always half falling down, the guard rotations, the letters written and unsent. Then stand to again at dusk, the valley going blue and then black, and the night watch and the cold. It is a life that sands a person down to their essentials. Whatever you actually are, 3 months on a wall like Kettle will bring it to the surface. It brought Prewitt's certainty to the surface, and it brought my cowardice to the surface, the specific cowardice of a senior man who knows better and says nothing because saying something would cost him the ease of going along, And when she came, it brought her essential thing to the surface too, though it took the canyon to show us what that was. Her essential thing was patience. Ours was the joke. The valley had all season to decide which one it would side with, and the valley, as it turned out, sided with the truth, the way it always eventually does. The platoon that owned the outpost was a good one, mostly young, hard, proud in the way that is half strength and half a thing that will get you killed. And they were run, that season, by a second lieutenant named Pruitt. I have thought about how to describe Pruitt fairly for a lot of years, and I still cannot do it without my own shame getting into the paint, so take this knowing the brush is not clean. He was young and he was smart, and he had been told he was smart his whole life, and both of those things had hardened in him into a certainty that the way he saw a thing was the way the thing was. He was not cruel for cruelty's sake. He was worse than that, in the specific way that matters here. He was funny. He could make a tired, scared platoon laugh, and he knew it, and he used it. And a lieutenant who can make men laugh can make men do almost anything, including things they will be ashamed of later, because laughter feels like agreement and agreement feels like truth. So when she came off that bird and stood in the yard with her duffel and her rifle case, and Pruitt walked over with that easy grin already loaded, I knew, the way you know a rock is going to roll before it rolls, that he was going to make something out of her, and that the platoon was going to laugh, and that I was going to stand in my tent flap and let it happen because it was easier than being the man who didn't. I want to tell you I was better than that. I was not that day. It started like these things do, as almost nothing. He asked to see her card. You have to understand what that means, so the joke lands the way it landed for them. Every soldier who fires a weapon for record carries a qualification, a classification, marksman or sharpshooter or expert, stamped and dated, the Army's flat little judgment of how well you shoot. It is not a secret. It is not a shame. Most people qualify somewhere in the middle and never think about it again. Asking to see somebody's gun card is not, on its face, an insult. That is what made it clever. Pruitt did not walk up and call her a name. He walked up, all friendly, and said he liked to know what he had in the fight, and he'd love to see her marksmanship card, for the record. And he said for the record with just enough weight on it that the men nearest him started to grin before they even knew what the joke was going to be, because they trusted him to be about to be funny. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached into her blouse and took out the card and handed it over, and did not say anything. Pruitt looked at it, and whatever was on it, he decided in that half second to make it a bit, because he held it up and squinted at it theatrically and said, loud so the yard could hear, "Would you look at that? Read it out for us. Go on, for the record." And he handed it back to her and stood there with his arms crossed and that grin, and the yard went quiet and waiting, and I stood in my tent flap 30 feet away and said nothing. I could not see what was on the card. Neither could they. That was the whole engine of the joke, that it didn't matter what the card said, because the bit wasn't about the card. It was about making her stand in the middle of the yard and perform for them, making the quiet new medic read her own paperwork aloud like a child made to read to the class, so that whatever she was, she would be small in front of them first. That is what a rank has joke really is, once you strip the cleverness off it. It is not about the rank. It is about making a person hold up their own credentials and turn them into a punchline before they can turn them into anything else. And she did it. That is the part I did not understand until much later. She stood there in the dust with her duffel still at her feet, and she read it out level, unhurried, in a voice that did not shake and did not rise, the classification, the date, the flat little line of it. She read it exactly the way you would read a grocery list. And because she would not perform the embarrassment, because she gave them nothing to feed on, the laugh that came was thinner than Pruitt wanted, and he covered the thinness by taking the card back one more time and pinning it, actually pinning it, with a thumbtack to the plywood board outside the CP where we tacked the duty roster and the mail call, right up at the top where everyone would see it, and he wrote above it in grease pencil, big, so it would read across the yard, "OUR Sharpshooter." They laughed at that. That one landed, And she watched him pin her card to the board, and she did not move to take it down, and she did not argue, and she picked up her duffel and her rifle case and carried them to my aide tent, because that was where she had been told to go, and she set them down inside the flap and looked at me and said, "Where do you want me, Sergeant?" Not a question. A statement with a period on it. First words she ever said to me. I said the cot's on the left. I did not say anything about the board. I want that on the record too, since we are reading things out for the record today. I had a rank on her. I was the senior man in that tent, and I had been in longer than Prewitt had been alive, practically. And I could have walked 20 feet and taken that card off the board, and I did not, because it was easier not to, and because some small ugly part of me had also already decided she was a medic pretending at being a shooter, and the joke flattered that part of me. So I let her card hang on the board under "Our Sharpshooter" in grease pencil, and I told myself it was not my business, and I went back to inventorying gauze. Here is what the joke bought them in exchange for the laugh. It bought them the right to stop looking at her. That is the real price of deciding early what a person is. Once the platoon had a slot for her, the aid station girl, the one who reads her gun card, our sharpshooter, they didn't have to see her anymore. She became furniture with a punchline attached. And that meant that everything she did over the next several days, every single thing that should have told them exactly what they had, went past them like water past a stone, because they had already filed her and closed the drawer. I saw it, though. Not because I was better than them, I have already told you I wasn't, but because she was in my tent, 10 feet from me, all day, and you cannot not see a person you share a tent with. And the things I saw did not fit the drawer I had put her in. She cleaned her rifle the first night the way a surgeon washes. I have watched a lot of men clean weapons. Most of them do it like a chore, fast and rough, run the brush, wipe it, done. She did it like it was a language she was fluent in and the rest of us were spelling out loud. She had it apart in a smooth, unhurried flow that never fumbled once, every piece laid out on a cloth in an order that meant something to her. And she checked things most soldiers don't know are there to check: the crown of the muzzle, tilting it to the lamp to look at the rifling's mouth, the bedding, the glass, which she cleaned with a separate kit and a patience that bordered on tenderness, breathing on it, wiping in slow circles, checking the reticle against the lamp flame to see it sit dead still. And when she put it back together, it was not the same rifle that a joke medic bobbies off a helicopter. It was a working tool in the hands of someone who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more, and considered every one of them worth doing right. I told myself, some medics are gun nuts, it happens, filed it, closed the drawer same as them. She read the ground too. In the morning she would stand at the wire with a cup of coffee, not talking to anyone, and she would look at the valley, but not the way you or I look at a valley, sweeping it, seeing terrain. She looked at it in pieces, holding on each one, and I watched her lips move once or twice, and I realized after the second morning that she was ranging it, reading distances off the land by eye and checking herself, the way a person keeps a skill warm. That rock, so far. That cut in the ridge, so far. The mouth of the throat where the road went dark between the walls, so far. I did not know the number she was saying, but I knew the shape of what she was doing because I had been around enough real shooters to know it when I saw it, and a small cold thought went through me that I pushed down because it did not fit the joke, and the joke was comfortable. There was more to it than ranging too, though I only understood the rest of it later, laying it all out in memory the way she laid out the rifle parts on the cloth. She was not just reading distance. She was reading the whole system of the valley the way a shooter has to, where the wind lived and how it moved through the day, cold and falling down the draws in the early morning, and then turning and rising off the hardpan as the sun got up, where the light would be behind her and where it would be in her eyes at which hour, which folds of ground a man could move through unseen and which he could not, where, if she were the enemy, she would put a gun to own that road. She was doing the enemy's homework and her own both every morning over coffee for a week, while we filed her under a joke. When the throat finally happened, she was not surprised by any part of it. She had walked that ground in her head a dozen cold mornings before we ever rolled into it. That is what the drawer cost us the chance to see. Not a talent, a discipline, the plain daily unglamorous work of a professional keeping herself sharp, done in full view, mistaken for a medic staring at the hills. And once, this is the one I think about most, one of the young riflemen, a kid named Boyer, was field stripping his weapon on a cot in my tent because it was raining and there was nowhere dry, and he seated the firing pin wrong, a small thing, the kind of small thing that gets a man a click instead of a bang at the worst possible second. She was 3 cots down rolling bandages. She did not look up right away. Then she did once, and she said, without getting up, without any edge on it at all, pins in backwards, and went back to her bandages. Boyer looked at it. She was right. He fixed it. He never said thank you, and she never asked him to. And he told the story that night in the other hut as the aid station girl thinks she knows my rifle. And they laughed. And I was there for that laugh too. And I did not say what I was thinking, which was. She called it from 3 cots away without a second look, and she was right. And that is not a thing a medic knows. There was another one, a smaller one, that I have never told anybody, that I only understood the meaning of much later. A resupply had brought up a case of a new lot of ammunition, and I heard her, one evening, quietly ask the supply kid what the lot number was, and heard him not know, and heard her ask him to find out, and watched her write it in that oilcloth notebook when he came back with it. At the time it meant nothing to me, a medic being fussy about ammunition, filed under the joke like everything else. What it actually was, I know now, was a precision shooter tracking her ammunition by lot the way she tracked everything. Because at the distances, she worked a change in the ammunition changes where the round goes, and a professional knows the number and writes it down and does not guess. She was quietly in the corner of my tent, maintaining a discipline that the best shooters in the world maintain and the rest of us have never even heard of, and I watched her do it and saw nothing, because I had already decided there was nothing to see. I want you to sit in that with me because this is the lesson and it is not the one you think. The lesson is not she was secretly great. You already guessed that. The title of the thing I am telling you gives it away. The lesson is that I saw it. I saw every piece of it. The rifle cleaned like a language, the ground read like a map, the pin called from across the tent. I was not blind. I had all the evidence a reasonable man needs, laid out on the cloth in front of me in an order that meant something. And I filed it under the joke anyway, every time, because I had decided what she was on the day she carried a box off a helicopter. And it is astonishing. It should frighten you. I mean it to frighten you. How much true evidence a made-up mind will swallow whole and still stay made up. Any medic can hold a rifle, Pruitt said once that week when Boyer's story got back to him. He said it grinning, waving a hand the way you'd wave off a fly. Doesn't make her a shooter. Holding it and using it are 2 different animals. And the men laughed, and I did not say anything, and the terrible thing, the thing I have to tell you if the story is going to be worth anything, is that when he said it, some part of me nodded. Because it was easier. Because he was funny. Because agreement feels like truth. She heard him say it. She was close enough. She did not react at all. She just kept rolling her bandages, and I have wondered ever since whether that was the moment she decided she was done trying to be seen, and simply resolved to wait for the ground to make the introduction she wasn't going to make herself. The range morning is the part I need you to hold on to, because everything that happened in the throat 3 days later happened here first, in front of all of us, in the flat, unbothered light of an ordinary morning, and we watched it and did not understand what we were being shown. The platoon ran a range that morning, nothing formal, just confirming zeros before the convoy mission Pruitt knew was coming down. We had an improvised long line at Kettle, a thing the guys had built by walking out steel plates along the flat below the outpost at rough distances and marking them with range flags, out to almost 2,000 meters at the far plate, which nobody ever hit, because nobody at Kettle was that shooter and everybody knew it. The far plate was a joke of its own. You shot at it to say you'd shot at it. It sat out there white against the brown at a distance the guys called the moon. She came out to the line because everyone came out. It was all hands. And Pruitt, who could never let a bit die once it had gotten a laugh, saw her there and could not resist. He called out loud, "Hey, our sharpshooters here. Somebody give the sharpshooter a rifle." And there was that laugh again. And he meant it as a joke, entirely as a joke, and it is the single luckiest cruel thing he ever did because she took him at his word. She did not take one of their rifles. She went back to the tent and got her own case, the one she'd carried off the bird, and she came back and opened it on the mat, and the men nearest went quiet the way men do when they see a tool they weren't expecting, because what was in that case was not a medic's carbine. It was a long precision rifle, a bolt gun, scoped with glass worth more than the truck we'd lost in the throat, and it had the particular worn smooth look of a thing that has been carried and used and cared for across a great many days and a great many places. She laid out a mat. She laid out a small notebook, oilcloth covered, its pages soft with use. She got down behind the rifle in a way that made the ground look like it had been waiting for her, and she did not fire. That is the part, she did not fire, not for a while. First she pulled a stub of chalk out of a pouch and she wrote on the flat of a flat rock beside her, in numbers cool as a school teacher. The wind, which she'd read off the range flags and the grass and the mirage coming up off the hardpan. The distance to the far plate, the moon plate, which she'd ranged and which turned out Boyer paced it later, half in disbelief, to be a hair over 1900 meters. And then a hold, a specific correction, a come up in the elevation and a lead into the wind, chalked out plain on the rock for anyone standing near to read if they cared to. And she said not loud to nobody and everybody, the way you'd note the time. Far plate, 2 rounds. First one's the range check, it'll land low left, I'll correct off it. Second one center. And Pruitt, delighted, sensing a bigger laugh coming when she missed the moon like everyone missed the moon, called out grandly, "The sharpshooter has called her shot, gentlemen," and got his laugh, and folded his arms to watch her miss. She sent the first round. Away out at the moon plate the dust kicked low and left, exactly where she'd said, low left the range check. The line got a little quieter. She reached up without hurrying and made one small correction on the turret, a click or two, reading it off the chalk on the rock, off numbers she'd written before she'd fired a single round, and she settled back down and she breathed, and between one breath and the next she sent the second round and a full beat later. Because at that distance the bullet has to travel, you see the hit before you hear anything come back. The far plate, the moon plate, the one nobody at Kettle had ever rung, rang. A clean hard clang rolled back up the flat to us across 1900 meters of nothing, and stood there in the air. Center, where she'd said, off numbers she'd chalked on a rock before the first round left the barrel. Nobody laughed. I want to be precise about what we had just been shown, because it matters enormously for what came later, and because it is the whole reason this is a story about proof and not a story about luck. She had not gotten lucky. Luck does not call low left and then correct and center on the second round. Luck cannot be chalked on a rock beforehand. What we had watched was a person read wind and distance and drop off raw ground with her eyes and a stub of chalk, predict exactly what the first round would do, use it as a measurement, and place the second one dead center at a distance the rest of us couldn't hit on our best day with a bench and a week to try. We had watched a demonstration. She had, without saying a word about who she was, shown every man on that line precisely what she could do and precisely how she did it, methodically, repeatably, on demand. And here is the thing that should keep you up at night the way it keeps me up. It still didn't take. Even then, there was a silence, yes. There was a beat where the joke wobbled. But Pruitt, who could not afford to have lost the bit in front of his platoon, laughed first and loudest and said, "Lucky wind," and clapped and called the range done. And the moment closed over like water. And by that night the story in the huts was not she made an impossible called shot. It was she got a lucky ring off the moon plate and the LT called it lucky wind, huh? They took a thing they had watched with their own eyes, and they filed it back under the joke. Because the drawer was already built, and it was less work to bend the evidence than to rebuild the drawer. She packed her rifle away without a word. As she passed me, she glanced at the board on her way back to the tent at her card, still pinned there under our sharpshooter in grease pencil, going soft now in the weather, and she looked at it for just a second, and then she looked away, and I could not read her face at all. I have spent years trying to read that face in memory, and I still can't. I don't think it was anger. I have come to believe it was patience. The patience of someone who knows the ground is going to make the introduction, and has decided to let it. 3 days later, we went into the throat. The mission was a resupply run north to the outposts past the canyon, and Pruitt planned it the way he did everything, cleanly and confidently, and with a gap in it exactly where his certainty was. The gap was the throat. You could not go around it. There was no around. You went through, and you went through fast, and you hoped that fast was enough. Pruitt's plan was a good plan for a road that didn't have anybody on it. It put the gun trucks front and rear, the soft-skinned supply vehicles in the middle, and it moved the whole thing through the gap at speed on the theory that a column that doesn't slow down is a column that doesn't get hit. It is a fine theory. It has one flaw, which is that it assumes the enemy will shoot at the part of the column that is moving, and a good enemy shoots at the part that has to stop. I was on that run because the aid station goes where the trucks go, and she was on it because I put her on it, which is a thing I did without thinking much about, and which I have decided to be quietly, privately glad of for the rest of my life, because it means that at least once, without knowing it, I did the thing that saved us. I told her to ride the rear gun truck with me. She brought her aid bag. She also brought the case. I saw her load the long rifle case into the truck, and I opened my mouth to say something about it, some small dumb thing. You won't need that, Doc. The joke still running in me even then, and I closed it again, because the memory of the moon plate ringing was still in my ears. And for once, one single time, I let the evidence win over the drawer, and I said nothing. She stowed the case where she could reach it. I have thought about that too. She stowed it where she could reach it, in the dark before dawn, because she had read the ground days ago, and she already knew what the ground was going to ask of her, even if none of the rest of us did. We rolled before first light. The valley was cold and blue and enormous, the way that country is in the early morning, all the violence of it gone soft and gray and almost kind, and the trucks ground up the road toward the gap with their lights off and the gunners hunched in the cold. I remember she was very still on the bench across from me. Not asleep. Still the way she'd been still at the wire with her coffee, taking the world in pieces and holding on each one. Once in the gray, she reached over and touched the rifle case. Not to open it, just to know where it was, the way you touch a thing in the dark to keep your bearing. And then she folded her hands again and watched the walls of the canyon come up around us and swallow the sky. There was a thing she did on that drive that I only understood afterward. She was watching the light. As we ground up toward the gap, she kept turning her head to read where the sun was going to come from, how it would fall into the canyon, which wall would be lit and which would stay in shadow as the morning came on. And she was doing, I realize now, the last piece of the homework, updating the week of cold morning ranging with the live conditions of this particular morning. This wind, this light, this cold. A professional does not stop working the problem when the problem gets close. She works it harder. While the rest of us rode toward that gap, either trying not to think about it or thinking about it too much, she rode toward it thinking about it correctly, thinking about it the way the one person who was going to be able to do something about it needed to think about it. And she did it without a word, hands folded, watching the light, and we took her stillness for a medic's nerves and left her alone with the exact calculations that were about to save what was left of us. I have wondered, too, what it was like to be her on that drive. To know because she must have known, she who had done the enemy's homework every morning for a week, to know, riding into that slot, that if it went the way the ground said it might go, it was going to come down to her again, to the shooter they'd pinned to a board, and that she was going to have to do the hardest thing she knew how to do under fire, up an angle at the edge of the possible, or watch men die that she could have saved. And to carry that knowledge in silence across the whole cold drive, hands folded, giving no one any sign, because there was no point in the sign and every point in the calm. I did not have the imagination that morning to wonder any of it. I was busy being afraid in the ordinary way. She was busy being ready in a way I did not have the eyes to see. That was the difference between us, all the way down, and it took a canyon to teach it to me. The throat is worse from inside than it looks from the wire. The walls come in until the road is a slot, and the sky is a ribbon, and the sound of the engines bounces back off the rocks, so it feels like the whole world is the inside of a drum. There is a place, better than halfway through, where the road bends and pinches at once, where a broken-down truck or a well-placed charge can stop a column cold, and everybody in that convoy felt the ground get wrong as we came up on it. The animal feeling, the watched feeling, and the gunners' hands tightened on their guns. They hit us at the pinch. Of course they did. It is where I would have hit us. The first thing was the lead truck stopping, not a crash, a stop, the deliberate stop of a driver who has seen the road blocked ahead and stood on the brakes. And the second thing, right on top of it, was the sound. If you have not heard a real ambush open up in an enclosed place, you cannot imagine the volume of it. It is not a sound so much as a pressure, a wall of it, the rock throwing every rifle and every machine gun, and the deep cough of an RPG back and forth between the walls, until it is one solid roar with no edges. They had it laid perfectly. They had the high ground on both walls. They had a gun up at the bend that could rake the stopped lead vehicles. And they had the whole column pinned in the slot where it could not maneuver and could not turn around and could barely, in places, shoot back at an enemy that was above us and dug into rock. The lead gun truck was in trouble immediately. I could hear it on the net. The lead was hit. The lead had wounded. The lead was pinned and taking fire. It could not answer because the worst of it was coming from a position high up the far wall, up near the bend, tucked into the rock at an angle where our gun trucks below simply could not elevate enough to reach it. A machine gun, dug in high and back, hammering down into the stopped front of the column, and every second it fired it was killing the men up there. And there was nothing. I heard this go across the net in Pruitt's voice, and for the first time since I'd known him, the funny was entirely gone out of it, and what was under it was a young man realizing his clean plan had a gap in it and men were dying in the gap. There was nothing anybody could do about that gun, because of where it was. It was too high, too far, tucked at an angle behind rock, a target you could only hit from a long way back down the canyon at a distance, and an angle that no rifle in that column could make. I need you to feel the inside of that minute the way I still feel it, because it is the hinge of everything and I do not want to hurry past it into the shot. The noise I have told you about, the solid wall of it, no edges. But under the noise there were the particular sounds that a man never forgets, that came through the wall in pieces. The specific flat whang of rounds coming off the armor of our own trucks. The driver of the lead vehicle screaming something on the net that was not words anymore. A young voice up front, very high, very young, calling for a medic, calling for me, and I could not get to him. None of us could get to him because the untouchable gun on the ground between. I have heard that voice in a lot of quiet rooms since. It belonged to a private named Delgado 19, and he was going to live, though I did not know that then. Then there was only the voice and the gun that would not stop, and the arithmetic of it, which every man in that canyon was doing at once, and which came out the same terrible way every time. Men were dying up front, the thing killing them could not be reached, and so the men up front were simply going to die, and we were going to sit in the slot and listen to it happen, and there was nothing in Pruitt's clean, fast plan, nothing in any of our training, nothing in the whole column that had an answer for it. Pruitt knew it too. That is the part I watched, because he was near enough to see. I watched a young officer understand in real time in the worst possible circumstance that his certainty had a hole in it exactly the size of the thing now killing his men, and that he had no answer, and that the only person in the column who might have had an answer was a woman he had spent a week teaching his platoon to laugh at. I do not know for certain that all of that went through his face in those seconds. I know some of it did, because I saw it, and because a man does not forget the face of another man, meeting the limit of himself with other men's lives spilling through the gap. No rifle in that column but one. I did not have to tell her. That is the thing. I turned to say something, I don't know what, something useless, "Doc, get down," probably, and she was already moving. She had the case open. She had the long rifle out, and she was over the tailgate of the truck and down onto the road in one motion that had no panic in it anywhere. None. And I understood in that instant, watching her move, that everything I had watched for a week and filed under a joke had been true, all of it, and that I had been shown the truth over and over and had refused it, and that the ground was about to make the introduction I'd been too much of a coward to make. She went back down the canyon, away from the fight. That is the second thing I need you to understand, because it looked, for one heartbeat, like the thing the joke had always predicted, the medic running the wrong way. But she was not running from the gun. She was getting distance and angle on it. She had read, in the 2 seconds it took to come off that truck, exactly what I have just spent a paragraph explaining to you, that the gun was untouchable from below and close, and that the only place on earth from which it could be reached was back down the throat of the canyon, where the walls opened enough to give a line, at a distance long enough that only one shooter in that column could dream of it, up an angle that only one shooter in that column had spent a week quietly proving she could read. She was not fleeing the problem. She was going to the one square of ground from which the problem could be solved, and she was going there at a dead run with a bolt gun, while the rest of us were still catching up to the fact that she was gone. I went after her. I don't fully know why, to help, to watch, because the aid bag was still on my back and there were going to be wounded, because some part of me finally could not stand to not see her 1 second longer. I got to her as she went aground behind a low shelf of rock where the canyon had opened just enough, and I dropped beside her with my medical bag in my useless hands, and I became, for the next 90 seconds, the closest witness in the world to the thing I now spend my life describing. She was already reading it when I got there. I had expected, if I had expected anything in that noise, with my heart going the way it was, I had expected haste. I had expected a person doing a desperate thing desperately. That is not what I found. What I found, in the middle of the worst noise I have ever been inside of, was a stillness. She was down behind the rifle in that same way the ground seemed to have been waiting for her, and she was not hurrying, and it was the not hurrying that told me, more than the moon plate had, more than anything, exactly who I was lying next to. Because hurrying is what you do when you are hopping. She was not hopping. She was working. She was reading the wind first. I could see her eyes go up the canyon, reading the dust drifting off the rock, the way the smoke from the burning lead truck leaned, the grass at the base of the wall, the same read she'd done on the range with the chalk, only now there was no chalk and no rock to write on and no time, and she was doing all of it in her head fast, and I could see her doing it. Her lips moved once. She was running the numbers she'd practiced her whole life to be able to run in exactly this much noise with exactly this much at stake. And the practice was the point. The practice was the whole point, because a person who has done a thing 10,000 times can do it once more when the world is ending, and a person who has only ever hoped cannot. "Range," she said, not to me exactly, but out loud, and I realized she was doing on purpose what she'd done on the range, narrating, calling it, making it a thing with steps instead of a prayer. Guns high on the far wall back of the bend, longer than the plate. And I understood she was telling me it was past 1,900 meters, past the moon, past the distance she had rung 3 days ago in the flat morning light, and that she was going to have to do it up an angle into a canyon wind that was not the honest, steady wind of the range, at a target that was shooting back and killing men every second she spent breathing. She built the shot anyway, out loud, step by step, the way she'd chalked it on the rock, the come-up for the distance, the hold into the wind more this time, the canyon squirreling it, the angle correction for shooting up at a thing above her. She said each one plainly, the way you'd read a grocery list, and I have thought since that she said them out loud partly for herself, to keep the panic out by keeping the procedure in, and partly, this is the part that undoes me, partly for me, so that the one man lying next to her would witness that this was not luck, would carry out of that canyon the knowledge that every piece of it had been read and reasoned and earned. So that if she lived, there would be a witness to the truth of it, and if she died, the truth would not die with her under a grease-pencil joke on a plywood board. Then she stopped talking. She breathed. I felt the world narrow down to the small space of her stillness in all that roar, and I stopped breathing myself, and she sent the first round. She had told me, the way she'd told the range, that the first one was the measurement. And it was. Away up at the bend, high on the wall near the gun, the rock puffed, and she read it. The miss, the exact distance and direction of the miss. The way she'd read the low left on the moon plate, and her hand went up to the turret and made one small correction off what the ground had just told her. One or two clicks, reading the world and answering it, and she settled back down into the stillness, and she breathed out, and in the pause at the bottom of that breath she sent the second round. And then the terrible waiting that is the truth of distance, the long beat where the bullet is still crossing all that murdering air, and there is nothing anyone can do but wait to find out what a person's whole life of preparation was worth. And at the end of that beat, high on the far wall, back in the rock where nothing we had could reach, the gun stopped. It just stopped. The specific solid hammering that had been killing the front of our column, the sound Pruitt's clean plan had no answer for, went out of the world, and in the ragged hole it left you could suddenly hear our own guns again, and men shouting, and the fire from the walls faltering as the enemy up there registered that the anchor of their whole ambush, the untouchable gun, had gone silent from somewhere impossibly far back down the canyon. She did not celebrate. She was already reading for the next one, because a person who has done this 10,000 times knows that one gun going quiet is not the end of anything. It is the first correction. She found the next position that mattered, a knot of fire up the near wall that had the middle of the column pinned, and she built that shot too, out loud, calm, the whole grocery list, and she made it. And then she made another, methodical, unhurried, each one read and reasoned and paid for in advance, and I lay there beside her with my bag of bandages, and understood that I was witnessing the exact thing she had shown us all on the range, and that we had, every one of us, agreed to call luck. It was not luck. It was never luck. It was a person doing, under the worst pressure the world can bring, the precise thing she had demonstrated cold in the flat morning light while we laughed, and the only difference between the range and the canyon was that, in the canyon, for the first time, we finally believed our own eyes. The ambush broke the way a fever breaks, not all at once, but decisively, the strength going out of it once the anchor gun was gone and two more positions behind it. An enemy that has laid a perfect trap and watched its centerpiece die from a place it cannot even see does not stay long. There is a point where the arithmetic turns against them, and they melt back up into the rock the way that country lets men do, and they were gone before we fully understood we had won. What was left was the aftermath, and the aftermath is where the aid station earns its keep, and where, I want to be honest about this, because it is part of the whole truth of her. She stopped being the shooter and became the medic again without a half-second's hesitation, as though the rifle had been the strange interruption, and the bandages were who she really was. She was up and moving toward the wounded before the last of the fire had died. She slung the rifle across her back, and she came up the canyon at a run with her aid bag already open, and she went to work on the men in the lead trucks, the ones the untouchable gun had been killing, and she worked on them the way she'd cleaned the rifle and read the ground and made the shot, smoothly, fluently, without waste, a person deep in a language she'd spoken her whole life. She had a young rifleman's leg packed and tourniqueted, and his color coming back before I'd gotten my own bag off my shoulder. She ran that casualty collection point like she'd built it. And the men she was working on, some of them had been in the yard when the card got pinned to the board. Some of them had laughed. The men she was working on looked up at her from the road with an expression I will never forget as long as I live, because it was the expression of people watching their own understanding of the world get quietly and permanently rearranged. They had just been saved by the aid station girl. They had watched, or heard, the untouchable gun die from a place only she could reach. And now that same woman had her hands inside their wounds, calm as morning, keeping them alive. You could see them trying to fit it together and failing, and the failing was the beginning of the respect, because respect very often begins as the collapse of a thing you were sure of. Boyer, the kid whose firing pin she'd called from 3 cots away, was one of the wounded. Not badly, a graze, a lot of blood, more scared than hurt. She worked on him and he stared at her the whole time, and at the end of it, in a small voice, he said the thing that I think the whole platoon was trying to say and couldn't. He said, "That was you. Up the canyon, that was you." Not a question. And she looked at him for a second and she said, "Hold still, you're not done bleeding," which was not an answer and was the only answer, and went on with her hands. She never once in any of it said a word about what she'd done. She never made anyone say thank you. She had made the introduction the ground asked her to make, and then she had put it down and gone back to work. And the not claiming it was, I have come to think, its own kind of enormous statement. The statement of a person who has nothing to prove because she has just proven it, and who knows the difference between the two. Delgado, the 19-year-old whose voice had been calling for a medic across ground no one could cross, she got to him. Once the gun she'd killed had stopped owning that stretch of road, she went up it at a run and got to him, and worked on him there in the open, and he lived. He is a grown man now with children of his own, and he does not know, unless someone has told him since, that the only reason he got old enough to have them is that a woman his platoon called the aid station girl read a canyon she'd never been in off a week of cold mornings, and made a shot the rest of us would have called impossible if we hadn't watched her call it on a rock 3 days before. I think about that a great deal. There is a whole line of people alive today, Delgado's children, and their children someday, because one woman refused to let a joke make her doubt what she knew she could do. The joke never had a chance against that. It only felt for a week like it did. The men she'd saved could not stop looking at her, and could not look at her either, both at once, the way you cannot quite look at a thing that has rearranged you. One of them, an older specialist named Quan, who had laughed as loud as anyone in the yard the day the card went up, tried to say something to her while she worked and got about 3 words out before his voice went and he had to stop. She didn't make him finish. She just said, "I know. Hand me that," and put him to work holding a dressing, which was the kindest possible thing because it gave a man drowning in his own shame something to do with his hands other than drown. She spent no time at all, that whole aftermath, on being right. She spent all of it on the wounded and on quietly giving the men who'd wronged her small, useful jobs so they'd have somewhere to put the thing they were feeling. I did not have a word for it then. I have one now. It was grace, not the soft kind. The hard kind. The kind that costs the person extending it something and gets extended anyway. The reveal, the part where we learned who she actually was, did not come from her. It never would have. It came, the way these things do, sideways from outside days later back at Kettle, and it landed on Pruitt like a wall coming down. There was a link-up at the outpost after the convoy limped back. A sergeant major came down from higher, one of those old hard men with a career longer than some of the huts had been standing, in to check on the ambush and the wounded, and to look us all in the eye the way that kind does. He came through the aid tent to see the casualties, and she was there, doing what she always did, and I watched the old sergeant major's eyes go across the tent and stop on her the way your eye stops on a face you know out of a crowd. And I watched something move across his weathered face that I had never once seen any man at Kettle direct at her, and it was recognition, and under the recognition was something a great deal like awe. He crossed the tent. He said a name, her real name, which I am still not going to give you, because she never gave it to us and it is not mine to hand out, and then he said, quieter, almost carefully, a call sign. Harrow. And she straightened up from the cot she was working over and looked at him, and something passed between the two of them, old soldier to old soldier, that the rest of us were not part of and never would be. And the sergeant major, this man with more time than half of us had years alive, came to attention in the middle of my aide tent and rendered her a salute. You have to understand what that does to a room. A sergeant major does not salute a medic. A sergeant major of that vintage does not salute much of anything without a reason that would stop your heart. And here he was, ramrod straight in the plywood-floored GP medium, holding a salute on the aid station girl, and holding it waiting until she, after a moment, almost gently, as though she were the one extending the courtesy, returned it, and held hers a half-second longer than his, and dropped it last, the way the senior does. And the whole tent had gone dead silent, and into that silence the sergeant major turned to the rest of us, to Pruitt who had come in behind him, and he told us, in a flat, hard voice that did not think it was telling us anything but plain fact, exactly what we had had among us for a week and made a joke of. I am not going to give you the citations, because she never did, and it would feel like theft. But the shape of it was this, that the quiet medic we had pinned to a plywood board under a grease pencil joke was one of the most decorated precision shooters the force had, a marksmanship instructor, the person they sent to teach the shooters, the one whose name was on the school's records, whose call sign the old hand said the way you say a thing you have heard about your whole career and never expected to stand next to. That she had been wounded, months back badly, and had spent her recovery doing the humblest useful things she could find, cross-training as a medic, and had taken the aid station fill at Kettle not because it was all she could get, but because it was work worth doing while her body healed enough to go back to the work only she could do. That the card Pruitt had made her read aloud in the yard, the card he'd pinned up under our sharpshooter as a joke. The sergeant major knew what was on that card, and he said it out loud, the actual classification, the top of it, the thing she had read out flat and unhurried while the platoon laughed at a joke that had, the whole time, been true. She had not been pretending to be a shooter. She had read her own credentials aloud to men who could not imagine they were real, and let them laugh and waited. The sergeant major was not gentle about it, and I have always been grateful for that, because gentleness would have let us off. He stood in the middle of that tent, and he told us plainly, in the flat voice of a man reading a fact, what we had done. He said her call sign again, Harrow, and he told us where he had first heard it, which was as a young man from men who had trained under her, men who spoke about her shooting the way you speak about weather that could kill you. He said that there were shooters walking around alive in that whole theater who were alive because she had taught them, and shooters no longer alive whose last good work had been possible because of what she'd put into them. He said, and this is the part that took the last of the air out of the tent, that he had personally, years before, sat in a classroom and been taught by her to do the exact kind of shot she had just made in the throat, the long angled canyon shot, the read the first round incorrect, and that he had never in his life been able to do it the way she could, and that he had spent the years since telling younger shooters about the instructor who could, and that he had walked into my aid tent to check on some ambush casualties and found her rolling bandages under a board that said our sharpshooter in a lieutenant's grease pencil. He let that sit. He was not performing it. He was a man genuinely unable to believe what he had walked into, and his disbelief did more to us than any speech could have, because it held a mirror up to exactly how large the thing was that we had made small. I looked at Pruitt while the sergeant major talked. I have to tell you about Pruitt's face, because the story is not honest without it, and because it is the whole reason I tell you any of this. He was a young man who had been certain his entire life, certain in the specific way that had made him good and funny and dangerous, and I watched every piece of that certainty come apart in real time as the old sergeant major laid out plainly what Pruitt had spent a week making a joke of. I watched him understand the moon plate. I watched him understand the pin in the rifle, and any medic can hold a rifle, and lucky wind, and the card on the board going soft in the weather under his own grease-pencil handwriting. I watched a man meet the full weight of his own certainty at the exact moment it turned out to be wrong, and it is not a small thing to watch, and I would not wish it on you, and I tell it to you precisely so that you never have to feel it the way he felt it. Or the smaller, quieter way I felt it standing next to him, because I had seen everything he'd seen and filed it under the same joke. Pruitt went to his knees. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make that theatrical, and it was not theatrical. It was one of the most human things I have ever watched a man do. He did not collapse. It was not a swoon. It was slower and worse than that. He had come into the tent still half carrying himself the way he always did, the platoon leader, the funny one, the certain one. And as the sergeant major laid it out and the truth of her settled over the room, the strength that certainty had been lending him all season simply left his legs, and he sat down hard on the plywood floor of my aid tent, in front of his men, in front of the sergeant major, in front of her, and he stayed there. He put his hand over his mouth. He looked up at her from the floor with an expression that had no funny left anywhere in it, nothing but the raw understanding of what he had done and to whom, and he tried to say something and could not, and tried again. And what came out was just, "I pinned your card to the board." Of everything he could have reached for, that was what came. Not the ambush, not the shot, not his men she'd saved. The card. The small, mean, clever thing. The joke that had cost him nothing to make and that he now understood had been him laughing at the best shooter in the force for the crime of reading her own true classification aloud without shame. It was the smallest of the wrongs, and it was the one he named, because it was the one that was purely his, invented by him, for a laugh, and there is no hiding from a cruelty that's small once you finally see it clearly. And this is the last thing, and it is the thing I most want you to carry. She did not gloat. She had every right on earth to. She could have stood over him. She could have said any of the 10,000 things he had earned. The whole shape of the week had bent toward this one moment where she could finally, justly, be as large as she actually was in front of the men who had made her small, and every instinct in that tent was braced for it. She did none of it. She crossed the floor to where he sat, and she reached down, and she took the young lieutenant's hand, and she helped him up off the plywood, the way she'd have helped up any wounded man, because she was, under everything and had been the whole time, a person whose deepest reflex was to put people back together. And once he was on his feet, she let go of his hand and she said to him, quiet, just for the two of them, though the whole tent heard it in the silence, "Then take it down, and we'll say no more about it." And that was all. That was the whole of her vengeance. She gave him back his feet and a way to live with himself, which is the one thing a man on his knees needs and the last thing he expects from the person he wronged. And she never raised her voice once, from the first day to the last, in any of it. The men were forming up outside by then. Word travels through an outpost like fire through grass. And by the time the sergeant major walked back out into the yard, the platoon had come to attention on their own, without an order, in the dust, facing the aid tent. And when she came out, going back to her wounded, going back to work, they held it. The whole platoon, the men who had laughed, standing to attention in the yard for the aid station girl. She stopped when she saw it. And she did the only thing that fit who she was. She came to attention herself, and she returned it to all of them, to the whole yard, and then she told them, in that same level, unhurried voice she'd read the card in to get back to work. There were wounded, and she went to see to them. And they did. That was the salute, and that was the end of it. She would not stand and be honored while men needed a medic, and somehow that, more than the shot, more than the salute, was the thing that finished remaking every one of us. Pruitt took the card down himself. I watched him do it. He walked out to the board and he pulled the thumbtack and he took her card down and he stood there a moment with it in his hand, and then he wiped the grease pencil off the plywood with his sleeve, our sharpshooter, wiped it clean. And he brought the card back into the tent and gave it to her without a word, and she took it and put it back inside her blouse where it had lived all along, and that was that. She rotated out a few weeks later when her body had healed enough for the work only she could do, and she went back to it, wherever it took her, and I never saw her again. She left the way she'd come, one duffel, the rifle case she carried herself, quiet. I do not think most of the platoon ever learned her real name. I am not sure it mattered to her whether they did. She had not come to Kettle to be known. She had come to do work worth doing while she healed, and she'd done it, the humble work and the terrible work both, with exactly the same steadiness, and then she'd gone. I have trained a lot of medics since. I told you that at the start. And I tell them this story, every one of them, before I'm done, and I tell them it is not the story they think it is. It is not a story about a woman who turned out to be secretly great, though she was. The greatness was never the lesson. The lesson is the drawer. The lesson is that I stood 10 feet from the truth for a week, watched her clean that rifle like a language, read that ground like a map, call the pin from across the tent, chalk the wind on a rock and ring the moon plate cold. And I filed every bit of it under a joke, because I had decided who she was on the day she carried a box off a helicopter, and it was less work to bend the evidence than to open the drawer back up. Every man at that outpost was shown the truth over and over plainly for free, and we all chose the joke, right up until the ground made us stop choosing. And the only reason it ended the way it did instead of with a canyon full of our dead is that when the moment came, she was exactly what she had been trying to show us she was the whole time. And one of us, by accident, because I'd told her to ride my truck, was close enough to finally see it. So here is what I want from you, since you were kind enough to lean in. The next time you are certain about a person, certain the easy, confident way that costs you nothing, the quiet one, the wrong-looking one, the one who carries the box funny, I want you to remember that a sergeant major once came to attention in a plywood tent and saluted a woman we had pinned to a board as a joke, and that everything he saw in her that day had been sitting in plain sight in front of the rest of us the entire time. The evidence is almost always there. The whole trick, the only trick, the one I failed and spend my life trying to teach so that you won't, is to keep the drawer open long enough to believe your own eyes. Her card said expert, top of it. She'd read it aloud in the yard, flat and unhurried, that first day while we laughed. It was true when she read it. It was true the whole time. We just weren't ready to hear a woman tell us plainly what she was, so the ground told us instead, out at 1900 meters, in a language none of us could pretend was luck. I have never once laughed at a quiet person since. It is the only thing I am sure I got right.